service plan or housing stabilization plan. And then we're going to link people to community resources. That's a really important part because we want people to have people to rely on after rapid rehousing. We found that consistently, especially with homeless families, is they may have resources and they may have connections, but these resources and these connections don't have resources to spare. So we're going to make sure to connect people to services and supports that have resources to spare and can support them through this housing stability process. And then we're going to wrap it up. Okay, so I just want to remind people, turn your cameras on as much as possible. We like to see your faces. If you have low bandwidth or you're not ready for, you don't feel like your camera ready, feel free to turn it off. But if you, we'd love to see your faces. If you would put your name in as you want to be addressed as your screen name. So I don't know, some people go by the middle name, some people go by a shortening of their name. If you want to put that in, use your screen name, that cuts out a lot of problems. Rachel's going to upload the slides and the handouts to the chat box, so you'll have them. You are welcome to them. We love interaction, so raise your hand, indicate something in the chat box, use the reactions button, comment, or you can just unmute yourself and talk. We're happy to hear from you. And what I'm asking people to do is, if you want to sign into the chat box, say hi, identify your site, program, what your job is, and let us know what your favorite morning beverage is. So we're going to let people get a minute to do this. And the reason for that is that one of the benefits of these trainings is often that people can make connections with each other and follow up. So if people have an idea of where you work, what your job title is, obviously what your name is, and the morning beverage is just to get to know each other a little better. So
hey, Andrea,
yeah.
Can I be annoying? Can I, so we did morning beverage last time.
Oh,
can I ask what people's favorite evening beverage is this time?
Yes, that's a better question.
That one?
Let's
is that okay?
Yep, that's perfect. Right. Sorry, I forgot about that.
No, that's okay.
Last time. So let's definitely do evening beverages. Iced tea. Okay, hi, Michael. Hi, Deborah. Rapid rehousing case manager. Hot tea, that's good. So Rachel likes ginger ale or seltzer. Yes, I'm a big ginger ale fan, though I discovered these Gus sodas that have half the sugar and they taste really good. They're very gingery. That's a good one. Wendell, Director of Family Services, Newcastle County, kombucha or IPA? I'm with you. It's good for you, the fermentation of both those beverages. Okay, let's see here. Carmen from Family Promise, drinks are the same, water. Yeah, water is good for you. Fran from Family Promise, red wine. Yes, I like a little red wine too. Anybody else? Alicia, Lawrence, had wine or water? Yep. It's a good one. Lisa is mint tea. Brenda Adams from Catholic Charities, basic needs case manager, hot tea. Yep. Those are all good ones. These are beverages we do to relax, right? So that's very nice. And Arenda, Diet Coke. Oh, hardcore caffeine. Okay. To be a big Diet Coke person. Is it always Coke, not Pepsi, Arenda? Sometimes people are set. Okay. So now you know a little bit about each other, and let's go to the next one. Here we go. So, whoops. Okay, so now I'm skipping around. I don't know why. Okay, so we did this. You know what I should ask people? Do people have comments on the last session? Any lingering questions, any comments, any reflections about the housing location portion that we did? Remember, it was both getting clients or clients ready for housing and getting landlords ready to provide the housing. And either one? No? Okay. All right. So as people move into housing and they're getting ready to move into housing, we've got to remember that we've got to engage them again. And remember, this is all about housing stabilization, right? We want people to be stable. We want them to have a base in the community. Housing is basically the shoes that people wear. In order to do that, we have to know what's important to people and how we work with people. So one of the things that we want to do is set up how we're going to work with people. And in order to do that, we want to be consistent and reliable and supportive. And by supportive, we mean we want to listen to people and key into what's important to them and also look for some comfort here. We want to explain our role because it's going to be really important that people are able to use us in our role in order to achieve housing stabilization. And we're going to talk about our role in the context of housing stabilization, in the context of people having a base in the community that they can rely on. We're going to always listen to what person is interested in, what their wants are, what their needs are. And we're going to key into that because that also tells you what people value. And if we know what people value, they're going to stay motivated to maintain housing. Remember, this is a big leap from being homeless for a period of time in order to go into housing. And there are tasks that are hard for people and that are not familiar to them. And in order to maintain their motivation, we need to know what they value. The other thing that we're going to do, and this goes to role, is we're going to find small things to work on together. Even if it's just that somebody get a piece of documentation or that they work on getting furniture together. No task is too small because what we're really focusing on is what our relationship is, how we do this cooperatively, how we listen to what people want, and how we work together to accomplish this task. So we're going to set the tone and mentor people to accept services in the future. We're also going to always connect the housing stability to what the person's long-term goals are. And we're going to talk about how to get an idea of what their long-term goals are. And finally, we're going to help people feel some comfort or relief. And we're going to seek to find that safety, comfort, having a bed to sleep in, and we're going to help them identifying it. So what we're trying to do is help people build equity in their housing so they want to keep it. But the most important thing is we're a consistent presence and we keep showing up. Even when people tell us to get away from them, we're going to say, okay, I can leave now, but I'll see you tomorrow. How do you like your coffee? We're going to keep showing up because that's a really core of our role. Okay. So how we're going to base some of this is the warm handoff. And I would really encourage you guys to talk to shelters and outreach programs or whoever refers into your program to really do this warm handoff. It's recommended as standard practice. And one of the things that we're going to talk about is what they've accomplished in this program before they come in. So have they explained to this person their rights and responsibilities? What are they buying into? Have they explained the rights and responsibilities of tenancy? Have they explained to them what the service is when they get into rapid rehousing? And what are the expectations of the service and what are the workers' roles and what can people work on with you together, right? They should know that they're going to have a case manager and these are the things that they're expected to work with a case manager on. And then, you know, we're going to talk about the stuff that they've accomplished in the first program in the shelter or in the outreach program and how those are going to be followed up on. What we're trying to prevent here is for people moving into housing, even rapid rehousing, and people saying, okay, we're done. I'm done. I don't need a case manager. I had a case manager. I got housing. I'm done. Go away. Have you seen that? They may be willing to meet with you to talk about the financial, but they are unwilling to talk about anything else. We want to set that up before people come in, and this is part of the warm handoff. We also want to encourage the shelter or outreach teams to meet with us and present the person that's coming in, talk about what worked and what didn't work, and talk about what will be most effective in helping them stabilize. What's the things they value? What are the things they want long-term? We're going to ask the tenants themselves these questions, but we're going to ask the workers these questions because they know. We're also going to make sure that we're going to ask questions, right? What do you think is going to come up? How have you handled this before? How does this person handle crisis? So you're going to ask the questions. You're going to try to get out as much information as possible in these meetings, both in the warm handoff meeting and the team meetings, but you're also going to realize that you may have to call them to consult. So we're asking them to be available to meet with the person and the new worker. By the way, this is a great thing for people who work in shelters to see people in housing. It's encouraging and it keeps them motivated. The other thing is it's very helpful if the person that you've got in housing has a chance to show off their housing to the old worker in the shelter who only saw them in that context. It cements them, it builds more equity in their housing. We want this to be important to people because you know what? If the housing is not important to people and it's not clicking with people, it's very hard to get them to manage the tasks that it takes to maintain the housing. So we ask people to agree to a series of visits and to consult. Is this something you feel like you can do with the shelters? Some of you actually have shelters or transitional programs or outreach programs in your own program. Is this a conversation you can have or are you already doing it? Is anybody already doing it? Just raise your hand, put in an emoji, talk to me. Is anybody already doing the warm handoff? Okay, I got
our shelter case managers, they do the rapid rehousing, so they do both.
Yep. Do they talk about the change in role when people move into housing?
They talk more about going to a supportive role and kind of trying to not be as present, because when they're in the shelter, it's like a daily back and forth. And so they talk a little bit about like people getting out there and how they can ask for help, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But it is a renegotiation of the contract between the CM and the family at that point, for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah, and as much as we can ritualize that renegotiation, it's really helpful, and also create those expectations of what life is going to be like in housing. So that's a great thing. Okay. Part of what we also need to do, and some of this comes in the warm handoff, some of this comes from maybe working with people in the shelter, and some of this comes from the tenant themselves, is we want to understand their housing history. We want to know where they've lived in the past 5 years, with whom, what was their role within the household? Were they the leaseholder? Did they pay any expenses? Did they trade something that they did for, such as, you know, babysitting or something like that, to be a part of how do they contribute to the household? What were their responsibilities in the household? Have they ever had a lease? And what was their experience of leaseholders? Many people have not had a lease, but some people have also worked with sort of small landlords who may not have a formalized lease or don't hold to the lease. And it was a very informal contract. So that we want to know what the expectations of past landlords have been and how this is different. We want to talk about their roles and responsibilities within the housing. What did they do within the housing? What were they responsible for? What were the expectations of them? We want to know what worked and what didn't work in the housing. And you want to ask the question. A lot of times people say, oh, I hated all my housing before. And you want to ask the question, was there anything you liked about it? Anything? And we want it because we want people to be more balanced and practice critical thinking skills. And we want to build on the things that they did like. And then we want to ask them, because a lot of times when we do this history, they'll already be in housing, though it's better if you do it before and then redo it, is if what their level of satisfaction is with the current housing. I was always afraid to ask that question because I was afraid people will say I hate it and I want out. But in fact, it's a very worthwhile question. And you know what? If people don't have some level of satisfaction, certainly it doesn't have to be perfect with their current housing, they're not as motivated to keep it. So that gives us an opportunity to increase the satisfaction and look at different parts of housing that mean something to them, which guides us to talking to people about long-term goals, but also guides us to people stabilizing in housing. We also want to know people's homeless history. We want to ask about the cause of the initial episode of homelessness, but be careful because this is often a traumatic experience. People may not be willing to talk about that. That's fine. We want to eventually think about what caused that, but we want to be careful and use some trauma-informed techniques around this, around everything, but especially this. We want to know how long they were homeless. We want to know where the places they stayed. We want to know how the places were organized. So if people lived in their cars, how was that? How did they manage their tasks? Were they around other cars? Were they in something? Sometimes people use parking lots that have a little bit more activity because safety was an issue. We want to have these conversations and we want them to describe it to us, and also the outreach team to describe us to it. We also want to know what people's routine was, because that's something that people who are homeless are busy. And that when they move into housing, they may lose some of those activities, and that interferes with people's structure and purpose and can create all sorts of problems in housing. So we want to know what their routine was so we can begin to replace some of that. We want to know what their supports were, and we want to know what their role was when they were homeless. What did they do? So sometimes people are the expert and advise other people about how to get resources. Sometimes people run errands for other people. Sometimes people are totally focused on their family. We want to know what those roles are so we can continue some aspect of those roles so they don't lose that when they leave homelessness. And that we can adapt those roles to a housing. So what we're going to do is we're going to divide you guys up in groups, and Felicia is going to put in the chat. So you want to pull up your chat, what these questions are. And if you see them before you go into the groups, you'll be able to see them in the groups. And so what you want to do is turn on your cameras when you're in the small groups so you can see each other and talk about what kind of homeless and housing histories are you seeing? Do the families you work with have experience as leaseholders? That's going to be very important. And sort of what was their experiences? And are families you are working with happy in their housing and motivated to maintain it? And if not, is there something they like about their housing? And the other thing is, how is housing success connected to the person's long-term goals? So that assumes that you know the person's personal goals and the long-term goals, and you can make that connection. So obviously you don't have to answer every question, but just these are guides for the discussion. So, okay. So Felicia is going to put those things in the chat. There we go. And then divide you guys in groups. And it's going to go into 5 groups. I know we have less people than we expected. So if you're in a group alone or a very small group, we may move you to another group. So don't be shocked. If you have questions, feel free to come back to the main room and we'll probably pop in if people have questions. But you got 5 minutes. And something will pop up on your screen that says you have to select that you're joining a group. You've been invited to join a group. And when it pops up in your screen, just click on it. Okay. So that should come up in a minute. You should have the questions in the chat. Everybody see that? Okay. So you've been invited to join a group. And then let's see. Okay, there we go. So people are coming in. There we go. Groups are starting to fill up. Okay. I have to say that when you return from breakout groups, usually Zoom mutes you. So if you don't want to be on mute, feel free to unmute yourself.
I just lost my group. This is Brenda Adams. I was like, what happened? I lost my group.
It probably just closed. There we go. So how was that discussion? What did you find out?
Oh, it was good. You know, that it seems like everybody's on the same page where, you know, it's taking people who we're working with a group that have lower incomes, and they have some judgments, and then some landlords are wanting 3 times the amount of rent, which is kind of hard for people, you know, to do.
Mm-hmm.
And then
And what's their experience in housing?
that's when something happened, and
Okay.
and I left for some reason.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, the barriers to accessing housing are high. So that's one of the reasons why it's really important to know what people's histories are, and also know what to focus on to help people stabilize in housing. And a lot of times, the income is the number one thing.
Yes, when we do sometimes have people who have judgments, which are also a barrier for them to get into a place with their credit score and everything else.
Yeah.
I mean, it's rare that you come across a client in that category that has a perfect credit score and perfect record.
Right.
So I find that either the apartment complexes, in my personal experiences, Milford is terrible about trying to get people into that area.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can give my own opinion, but I don't think needs to be discussed here. But you either have to go with a private landlord,
Mm-hmm.
you know, that is willing to look the other way when it comes to a background check, or you're probably not going to get your client into an apartment complex in the Milford area.
Okay.
You know, so you end up having to go someplace else. So, you know, I think that, you know, currently it's difficult to find housing for a few reasons. COVID is one of the major ones right now. But I think if you start forcing landlords to accept Section 8, you're going to find less landlords. I think there's a lot of landlords that are, especially the private ones, that are on the edge of doing it already simply because they're getting the short end of the stick most of the time. So I think what will happen is they'll just end up getting out of the business. So it may end up being a double-edged sword.
Yeah, and if I could add, I had a chance yesterday to review a Senate bill, which is it's in Delaware's General Assembly. And I did read the whole thing. I think that's going to be a real barrier if it gets, you know, through the House and the Senate in Delaware and signed by the governor. Because when I read it, it's really, I think sometimes in my experience, I don't have a lot of experience in this, only 2.5 years. I think sometimes when they write these legislations, it's people that don't know much about this field or the people who we service. And it's the whole bill is written to protect the client. And I kind of agree. I think we're going to lose some landlords in general. I've already been told there's people that won't rent to me anymore because of what happened with the evictions and the rent not having to be paid. And I do find in Newcastle County, some of your apartment complexes, they want that 2.5, 3 times the income now. So I'm not so sure where it's going, but yeah, I kind of echo what the other gentleman said. It's we're going to have to be depending on some private landlords, and that could become costly at the end of the day.
So Michael, you don't think?
Andrea, you're muted. Because I muted you because I was trying to figure out how to get rid of the echo when Michael was talking. There you go.
Yeah. So one of the most effective ways to work with landlords, and I see the small landlord thing, is to help them have a good experience with somebody, and then have them convince other people that there are benefits to this. It's not unlike talking to people about, if you talk to somebody about what kind of housing did you have before, none of it worked for me. Was there anything you liked about it? You want to have those conversations with landlords. And yeah, small private landlords may be more open to it. So talking about the costs and benefits of Section 8. But it's interesting to me that this discussion turned into access to housing, but how does it affect stabilization in housing? And that just like the landlords that are reluctant to take people, it puts extra pressure on people. And what are we telling people about what the expectations are of the landlord when they do get housing? And how can they meet those expectations, and what has been their previous experience? Because that's going to have something to do with how they handle the landlords in the future. So you really want to have these conversations about what their history is and do some planning around how they're going to stabilize in housing. That will also help making those connections, especially with small landlords. If they have a positive experience where somebody's able to stabilize in housing, they may be more willing to take people in the future. So it's making sure that people understand what are the expectations of tenancy and how this might be different from their previous housing experiences is really important. Mark, it looked like you wanted to say something.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, this is all connected to
Right.
stabilization.
Right.
There's a few things that talking with the landlord is all fine and great. The landlords have their own bad experiences, and the best thing I can do is let them know that our program is there for the client. But to get a client to change their attitude and their overall ability to stay in housing and stabilize, a lot of it is long-term education, working not just with the client but with the landlord. And just through my experience, you can predict that to change a person's habits to where they're actually being a good tenant. I mean, it could take 6 months to a year, and most of our programs don't follow people that long.
Yeah, what they're finding is to make those new habits, it's usually in the first 6 months, and it's really important. And one of the reasons we did this exercise is to get a jump on it. So we want these conversations to happen even before people go into housing. And what we tell shelters is you want to start the eviction prevention process before people have housing. So that, yes, it is an education process. It's also a process to identify what motivates people to stay in housing. And if they don't see the benefit of housing, and if it doesn't track with their own values and what's important to them, they're not going to do it no matter how much education you provide. So it's got to be important to them. And that one of the stuff is you want to get this started before they go into housing, and you want to start the education process. And part of it is, why do you have to pay rent? What's important to landlords? What's the process? How can you keep your housing? A lot of people think that, I've talked to a lot of clients who think rapid rehousing is 6 months, so that's how long they get housing. Is that what we're going for? No, right? So we want to start that process to talk about that. And in fact, they may be able to keep their housing. And these are ways that they can keep their housing, but they have to like something about their housing, right? So we want to go for that too. And that's what this is about. But a lot of the way that they interact with landlords and interact with the system is what they've been trained in their other housing. And a lot of landlords out there are pretty rogue, right? Or some of the landlords in New York are pretty feral, right? So they do things like tell the person they got to get out. You know what? You're making me mad. You got to get out. Do people have to get out? No, there's a process, right? So, and how do you correct violations? Those are all the education parts, but we've got to identify what are people's expectations and what has been their experience and how are they generally going to react, and then take those things and provide that education about, you know what, you don't have to leave when your landlord says to get out. These are some options you have. We can address these problems. Want to have those conversations.
Again, you're short, giving the landlord the short end of the stick. I mean, in my program, I have landlords that I work with on a regular basis.
Mm-hmm.
So my goal is to support the client, and that's
Mhm.
always first, support the veteran.
Sure.
But I also have to keep my landlords too.
Yep.
And you're saying that, the landlord says, oh, get out, but they know they can't have, like, give COVID's done a lot of damage, in my opinion, to the landlord side, because they can't even charge late fees.
Mhm.
And to me, that's ridiculous, because the landlord's like, I can't collect money. I can't collect the rent. I can't collect the late fee. I've got a guy in here that's not working, and he's sitting here doing nothing. Maybe he's doing drugs, who knows? And I can't even evict him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that we're talking about a specific COVID situation, but that you can evict people in other ways, and that there's a process. We want to support the process, but we also want to support the expectations. And I would not support a landlord that said that what they're going to do is throw people out of their housing. I would help them do the process. I know it's frustrating with COVID, and it's probably really frustrated with landlords, right? But something had to be done.
Well, what they ended up doing, the landlords ended up doing, is they found ways around it, and basically they either harassed the client enough to where the client was like, I'm out of here, or two, they just didn't renew the lease.
Uh-huh.
And the client had to leave.
Uh-huh.
So one thing just that I think is really, really important that folks know is that any landlord saying they can't get their rent paid is lying. Just to be
Right.
clear,
Okay.
there's $200 million available for landlords in the state. All they have to go is go to DHAP, submit an application. They can get up to 15 months of rent paid.
Mhm.
So anyone who says they can't get the rent paid is lying or not willing to do some really basic paperwork. Please share that information. Please, please.
And I have to say, Rachel, that I disagree with you about the lying thing. I think that's kind of, it's an overkill on comments there. But
well, how else can you explain? Sorry, this is very, very this is very concerning to me. If you come across a landlord who has a tenant who hasn't paid rent for months and they're pursuing eviction, please let them know about this resource. Any landlord in the state can apply for this resource that will pay months and months of unpaid rent.
Okay,
there's no reason why they can kick folks out.
Again, you cannot sit there and say that the landlord's lying, because
or they don't know.
They may be uneducated on that topic.
That's correct.
So
Sorry.
my point is that we're talking about educating the client, okay, and supporting the client to where they want to stay in housing until they, but we also got to educate the landlord on where those programs are that are available.
No question.
Absolutely.
We want to make the landlord
one without the other.
We want to make the landlord whole, but let me take an issue here, right? If the landlord is harassing the tenant in order to get them out, that's illegal. And we are under no circumstances going to support that. I know you weren't saying to support that, but we are not going to support that. We're going to provide education of how they can use the process, just like we teach the tenants how to use the process.
Correct. And you're absolutely correct on that. But the question is how, what is the clients like about their apartments? There's a nice world up there in, like Rachel said, she doesn't deal face-to-face with clients. There's that nice office world. And then there's reality down on the street.
Oh, wait. All right.
Okay.
First of all,
the reality on the street is, if a landlord wants that guy out, he's going to harass him. Okay. Not all of them do, but some of them do. Okay. And you're absolutely right. That's when I have to stick up for the client. Okay. But It's a reality. And we have to address that reality.
You know what? There is, okay, so let me give you an example, okay? So in my neighborhood in New York City, there have been 6 bank robberies in the last 6 weeks. Okay? And people don't have money, and maybe it's a reality that banks are going to get robbed. They are being robbed. That's a reality. But the truth is, it's not legal, right? And we're going to address that. And that there are plenty other ways to get money, and we're going to provide some education about that. But first, we're going to say this is not legal. The other part is providing education is identifying what landlords want, right? And what landlords want is to get paid. So we're going to talk to them about what are the resources to get paid, but it's the same thing. What do they like about renting to tenants? That they get paid, right? So we're going to figure out what the motivation is for the landlord, but we're also going to figure out what the motivation is for the client. And we're going to negotiate that, which is basically what you're saying, but that we are not ever going to support, and we have to do both. And that you're right, our primary responsibility is to the people we serve, right? And that the clients are going to come first, and we're going to advocate for them, but we're also going to do the same process with landlords. And I think that that's the point, because we need a partnership with the landlord and the tenant in order to maintain housing.
Absolutely.
So we are going to find out what people want. We are going to provide that education, but we're also going to provide the education with the tenant, and we're also going to provide, and we're not going to hold back on things that may piss off the landlord. Like if the landlord is harassing them, they can get a lawyer. And we're going to make sure that we offer those things. We're also going to tell the landlord that, right? Just as we would tell the tenant, it's not acceptable not to pay rent, we would tell the landlord, it's not acceptable to harass people. Here are your other options, right? So that's the point of this exercise.
But Andrew, I'm going to agree with a lot of what Mark said, because what happens is, and Rachel's right to a degree, there's money. I'm a property owner. There's money out there for people who aren't, for landlords, but the landlords know that this is a short-term fix.
That's
so
right.
Right now, I can go get that money. Now I don't have these problems. I don't do this work, but I can go get this money from one of our landlords. But what it tells the landlord is, I don't want to go through this no more. I'm not working with you no more, Michael. I get it. I want to help people, but this is a lot of time. To landlords, owning properties and renting them is a business. I'm sorry, it's become a business. It's like a plumber or electrician.
There's
They
no
want to
question
be,
it's a business.
So these people, and I've never had a landlord harass a client because I wouldn't tolerate it, because I'm in contact with my landlords, constantly. But I've had some recently tell me, I'm just not going to work with you no more. I'm sorry, this has been more hassle. I know COVID added to the hassle and everything else, but they're good people, and it's not that they're not good people. They just don't want to go through this no more, and so they're not going to. So it's a combination of things, but I've never had a landlord harass a client ever.
Right. So Michael, one of the things that we're not saying, love your landlords, right? We are saying don't support illegal activities. We are saying educate them on what's available to them. And we are saying that work with both the client and the landlord to create a good experience with landlords, because just like we ask clients what they liked about their housing, there are things that landlords like about this program. And we want to look for those things. So we want to look for motivation to do this again. That's really the point of this exercise. And we have to do that with landlords, and we have to do that with the people we serve. We want to look for motivation to do this again. And that we want to make the experience as good as possible for landlords, but we don't. The other thing is, we talk about clients who revert to old patterns when they're homeless, right? People who go back to the encampment, stuff like that. And we try to address those patterns. There are going to be landlords who like to do it the old way, right? When I first started working in New York, I was a tenant organizer. And this was in late in the like 1978 or something like that. And you know what? The landlord had it was SROs, and the landlord had a stack of baseball bats behind his desk. And he called them the persuaders. And he would say to me, he would say to the tenants, "Don't make me get my persuader." And he would whack people with these baseball bats, right? So we talked to him. We talked to other ways to get what he wanted. We figured out what he wanted, but eventually we sued him, right? So that one of the things is we don't want landlords going back to their own patterns, and we don't want clients coming back to the old patterns. And we're going to start with persuasion, and then we're going to move to structure, right? We will say to a tenant says, "I want housing without paying rent." Is there any housing like that? No. But what they're really saying is they want enough money to live on. So we can work on having enough money to live on, but we can't work on housing that doesn't pay rent. Landlords will say, "I want tenants that are going to stay, that are going to be quiet, that are going to follow all the rules," right? You know any perfect tenants? Are you perfect tenants? I'm not a perfect tenant, right? But we're going to offer landlords a way to get the things that they want, which is a well-maintained property, consistent tenants, and consistent rent payments. But it may not always be the way that they want, and it may not always be the old way. That's what we're saying. So we're going towards motivation first and persuasion, but we're also identifying what's negotiable and what's not negotiable. And for a tenant not paying any rent for the rest of their life, that's not negotiable, right? That's not going to happen. But let's talk about what's behind it. And for a landlord, everybody being a perfect tenant, that's not going to happen. And you know what? They don't have that with non-Section 8 tenants. We want to create a good experience for both the stakeholders. That's really what this is about. Does that make sense? Okay. Part of what we're doing, and once again, we're starting with the clients, right? Because that's the primary part of our job. So one of the things that we're going to do is we're going to build a plan. And it's going to be focused, and it's going to be limited to the 3 areas of intervention, 3 small goals. We're always going to refer to the long-term goals, but we're going to work on 3 small goals. We want people to have some success, and that people can't concentrate on doing more than 3 things at a time. In fact, 1 goal is fine. And we're going to focus on the most pressing needs that impact housing stability, right? So it might be income, so they can pay rent and they can have enough money left over. We're going to relate all information or interventions to tenants' long-term goals, right? What are their long-term goals? What do they want to accomplish? What do they want their life to look like? And we're going to talk about that. We're also going to be aware that this is not a linear process. And to Mark's point, with landlords, nor is it for tenants. So we want to pick it up where they're going. We want to reframe the setbacks. We want to help people move forward. And we always want to be mindful of moving from crisis. And what I'm talking about is most of the tenants that we work with have been in crisis their whole lives. And that what crisis breeds is a very reactionary problem solving, right? So I have this problem, I'm going to be evicted. So what are my choices? I can leave my apartment. Well, what are your other choices? So we're going to move more towards planning and expanding people's choices to meet the goal, as opposed to this really reactionary thing. We're also going to put off, the immediate gratification. This is it. I'm going to leave right now. It may be more of a process. So we're going to help people do that, but we're going to move towards planfulness, which will help people making those reactionary decisions that usually get them in trouble. So we're always going to think about how can we move this person towards away from crisis? How can we move this person to be more planful? And how can we increase the choices that people have within the context of following the lease? Okay. We're going to focus on the service plan on greater self-sufficiency, right? Rapid rehousing is built on moving people towards independently maintaining their apartments. So that means we're going to do some goal setting, right? And we're going to talk about goal setting in a minute. We're going to connect people to high quality services and supports so that if they have a problem in the future, they can connect with people who will help them. It doesn't always have to be us. We don't have to be the nexus of people's lives. We're going to use the shared decision-making model, which means really paying attention to what the person values. And we're going to use a harm reduction approach. So harm reduction means changing behaviors to change the outcome. It doesn't mean changing outcomes to change behaviors. So it's a very different approach. So we're going to change the outcomes through changing behaviors, and we're going to give people options for behaviors. And we're going to practice this just like we did last time. We're also going to use success and people moving through the plan, right, to build confidence. And if people feel confident in their ability to negotiate, they're going to try it again. We're going to always focus on long-term stability. It's not a point of rapid rehousing to stabilize people for 6 months. It's the purpose is to create a base in the community that they can hold on to long-term. So we're going to connect the person's goals to keep the motivation high. And we're going to always connect housing stability or having a base in the community to that. We're going to assume roles and meet expectations of tenancy and in the community. And we're going to teach people how to do that. We're going to educate people how to do that. And we're going to create a strong expectation that person contributes to the community that they live in. And we're going to work on structure and purpose. And we're going to work on people reassuming roles, because roles give people structure and purpose. And that helps them stabilize in housing. Okay. So I said CTI plan here. I should have taken that out, but this is basically taken from CTI. So we're going to set goals as a team, right? And we're going to use the so that principle. So let me tell you what the so that principle is. Somebody says they have a goal, right? So we ask people what their goals are. What do you want? A lot of times when people tell us their goals, when we're doing a plan, they're programmed to tell us things we want to hear. So I used to hear a lot of people say, I'd like to be sober and I'd like to take my medication as planned. Okay, if a 13-year-old kid who was growing up told you what their goals for adulthood was, and it was sobriety and taking their medication as planned, what would you think? Right? Really what the person's goal is we're going to find out. So, okay, so let's talk about sobriety. Great thing. Pursue sobriety. So that what will happen when you get sober? What do you imagine will happen when you get sober? So that you want to pursue sobriety so that what happens, right? And people will tell you, I can reunite with my kids. I can, you know, I want to work towards owning a house, and, you know, alcohol or drugs are expensive and it's tough. Okay. But if people have a reason to pursue it and can keep going on goals, is sobriety achieved once people stop drinking or drugging for a period of time? No, right? It's a long-term process. And in order to keep people motivated towards that, we want to make sure that we know they want to do this so that what? And those are deeply personal, and those reflect values, and those will encourage people to change behaviors so that they can stabilize in housing. We want to focus on phases, and we want to decrease support as people use this network of support. And we want to use housing and tenancy as a functional, right? Because we're going to use the fact that people were able to be good tenants as a reason to get more apartments. We want to clearly define the steps to the goals so they're measurable and people can see progress. And we want to realize that longer term goals need connections to other resources. I can give you a plan, but I didn't include it this time because I think that you guys all have your own plans and that would be too confusing. All right. We're also going to talk about motivation. Okay. So let's talk about somebody is having problems in housing. All right. You got somebody with problems in housing. Let's say somebody's not paying their rent. right? When we talk about the landlord is not happy, you're not paying your rent. So what can we do about this? Somebody's in pre-contemplation, they're going to say to you, I'm not paying my rent. You're not paying their rent. Nobody's paying their rent. So don't talk to me about rent. Nobody has to pay rent. It's COVID. Is that true? No. So they have no awareness of the problem. They have no interest in addressing the problem or the housing issue. So what are you going to do? You're going to ask questions to raise their awareness, right? You ever been in a situation where somebody doesn't see something as a problem and you do, and you get in that push-pull situation? You have to pay your rent. I don't have to pay my rent. Yes, you have to pay your rent. No, I don't have to pay my rent. You ever been in that situation? What do you get out of that? Nothing. So you want to ask questions. What would be a reason to pay your rent? What's the landlord's perspective on this? What do you think about this? You want to ask questions to raise awareness that it might be a problem. Somebody might be aware of the problem and they're considering things, right? They're aware of the problem. They're considering housing. They're considering stabilization. Let's talk about the pros and cons. Yeah, I know the landlord wants my rent and that's part of tenancy, but you know what? I'm also thinking about just taking the 6 months and moving back to homelessness. So what are the pros and cons? What are the pros and cons of housing? What are the pros and cons of losing housing? What are the pros and cons? What are going to be their options if they get dumped out of this apartment, right? We want to talk about the pros and cons, but we want them to come from them. As people go to preparation, we want to talk about options, strategies, and realize that people are not ready to make the leap yet. When they're ready to change the behavior, we want to support it, and we want to really do a crisis plan around eviction prevention. And as people accomplish their goal, they pay their rent, we're going to move on to new goals. They might want to get a reference from this place. They might want to keep this housing. They might want to move into another type of housing. How can they accomplish those things? And those goals will keep people focused. And also, if we connect housing stability to them, they're more likely to get a better place next time if they get a reference. So how do they get that reference? We're going to keep them motivated by keeping them working on goals, and we're going to keep people structured. Does this make sense? This is taken right out of the stages of change, but the most important thing is to really review the staff tasks. Okay, so we're going to have a goal discussion, right? So Felicia is going to put them in the chat box. So one person can share an example of something the tenants want or something that they want. It's actually easier to share something you want, like, I don't know, going back to school or something. It should be simple and not too personal, right? Because remember, this is a work situation, right? So you don't want to talk about, like, I'm trying to decide whether to have a baby. So you want to keep it not too personal, right? A lot of people do sort of like healthy eating, going back to the gym, that sort of stuff. So one person in the group is the worker. So they want to know, what are the reasons behind this goal? So that what happens? You want to eat healthy so that what happens? What do you expect to happen if you eat healthy? In other words, I want to do that so that this happens. The other people in the group are the observers, and they're going to report back on the conversation. If you have too few people in your group, then just proceed with the worker and the client. So we're going to put these questions in the chat box. They should go up in a minute, or they might already be up. I'm going to check. Yep, they're already up. And then one of the things that we're going to do is break you out in groups, and this time you have 10 minutes. So feel free to do it for yourself. It should be a small goal. Actually, doing it for yourself is usually better. And then we're going to have the so that conversation. Is this, people get the instructions? You can always come back into the main room. I'll pop into the groups, but we want to make sure that the groups are all full. Okay, so you're going to get warning, and you have to join these groups. So is everybody there? Yeah, there we go.
And then I'll just let folks know real quick. These groups are supposed to last about 10 minutes, right, Andrea?
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
Focus on resources because people will need some support post rapid rehousing, right? So we want to focus on their community connections. And this is core to helping people manage in the community. So we've sent you a resource guide. And what's important is a lot of people have trouble tracking their resources. They have a hard time organizing them. So it's a resource guide that's designed for the tenant. Do you see it? I'm going to bring up the resource guide. All right, let's see here.
Just so folks know, I had added that file to the chat earlier on. So if you want to take a look at it, it's higher up in the chat from earlier in the meeting.
Yep. Can you see this? Can you see the resource guide? Is it up? Can you see it on the screen? Yes, no?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay. So you see how it's organized? So it's family members' names, demographics on the top, and then it has emergency resources. You can be relieved that I'm not gonna read it to you. For Mark in particular, it has some VA specific forms integrated into it. But we want to talk to people about who they're going to get help from besides the case manager. And this builds their network of support to maintain their housing going forward. So, and then you want to ask like things like who has permission to enter your home, who's going to care for your children, do they have long-term care things, who's going to care for your pet if something happens, this isn't a crisis, and what do they need to bring with them in a crisis. We recommend that you give this to people with an accordion folder, preferably a waterproof accordion folder. For some reason, I always got documents that were wet. I didn't want to think about why they were wet. So we give it to them, or if you don't have money for an accordion folder, use a big plastic bag, like a Ziploc, so that people can keep their documents in one place. It goes through housing. You can ask people, do you have a copy of your lease? Can we put it in this bag? And then what do you need in terms of housing documents? You'll see there's a VA form at the top, which is a DD-214, which is actually their ID. But you also want the lease, their house rules, if they have house rules, any notices from the landlord, rent receipts, inspection schedule, utility bills, those sorts of things, housing plan, they can all go in the form. So then they have a number to contact the Social Security office. If they need medical assistance, who do they call? The bank, what's the number? Emergency resources, assistance. This is where you can do some education around this. And then it is the forms that they need. So you'll see there's a VA form at the top, and the rest of them are things that people need if they're going for resources so they can refer to them. You see things like tax forms, identification, pay stubs, right? Medical, who's their provider. It gives you an excuse to answer this. Nobody's going to fill out all the lines in this form, but you want them to have as robust a support system as possible, and you want it to be in their control. So this is their form. Then what kind of documents do you bring when you go to see a doctor? This is a mental health one. You can see that. What kind of documents do you bring? Substance recovery resources. It's given an excuse to ask people if they have a sponsor, if they have a friend, do they use AA meetings? Do they have a counselor? Who's their program? What are the things they're going to bring? It reminds people about their recovery plan, their relapse prevention plan, insurance, meeting book. Education, employment, same things. Schools, teachers, employment programs, counselors, education advisors, tutors, peer, colleague, and then the things that they ought to keep. Pay stubs, in the case of veterans, GI Bill award letter, documents, voc rehab letter, those things, schedule. And then these are community connections. Do you think this would be helpful to go through with people? Yes, no, raise your hand, put an emoji in. It's there. It's been helpful to people in the past. So it's something you might want to think about, because we want to really emphasize that people need these community connections, and these community connections are the way to reach their long-term goals. The other thing this does is get the case manager out of the nexus of people's lives. I don't know if you've ever worked with somebody like this, but I worked with a lot of people whose answer to every kind of problem was 1-800, where the hell is my case manager, right? And that's just not sustainable. So we want people to look for more specialized skills with people and develop a network of care, much like we do. We all have people that help us with different things, and we know who we can call on for different things, and that we want people to develop those kinds of resources. And this is a tool in order to do that. So I see a question in the chat. I feel like it's helpful, okay, Wendell said, because it makes people think about some of the natural resources they do have. That's exactly right. Yep. It makes people think about it. It also prompts the conversation with the case manager, because we want a combination of service resources and natural resources, and most people rely more on their natural resources. You also are going to get very specific if you do crisis plans with people. If I can't pay my rent, who am I going to call? And it should not be my case manager, right? The case manager might be one of the people you call, but who else can you rely on? My mother's given me some money in the past. Sometimes I go to my church, they help with this in the past. It allows people to establish that they have more than one choice if one choice doesn't come through. Case manager can be amongst the choices, but it can't always be the only choice, right? We're getting people to think in a more planful way about how to resolve conflicts. We're also thinking about what are the expectations and how are they going to resolve those. Okay. The resource guide often takes multiple conversations. People are not going to come up with them all at once. We suggest that people start this process when they're in shelter or they're living in their cars or wherever people are living. It has standard domains, so it prompts the conversation around resources that people don't have. It's a good excuse to start talking about substance stuff, even if people deny they've got any problem. You want to ask the questions anyway. It also shows areas where people have strong support, and people are often surprised about their own network of care, and it prompts them to think about that when they have a problem. It's also an opportunity for an evaluative conversation if these resources are working for them and if they need to add resources to this list. Because part of our goal, especially in rapid rehousing, is to develop this network of care, which is what helps them maintain housing. We also want to clearly articulate our role. We want to, when we move people into housing, we want to meet with them and the landlord. We want to assist them to set up their apartment. We want to acclimate them to the neighborhood. We want to talk about the lease. We want to talk about contact with their landlord. We suggest that when people first move into their home that you see people at least weekly, and that it's very important that you do home visits, right? If people are in the office, they can tell you anything, right? But if you're in their home, it's a different conversation. We want to see how people react to them. We want to see them interacting with the landlord. We want to see them interacting with their neighbors. We want to see how their home is set up. So to achieve this stabilization goal, it's really important to do home visits. We also want to accompany people to resources. That includes the landlord, but that also might include their service resources, and in some case, their community resources. Observe their negotiation skills. We want to set up a system, right? We're putting together a structure so people can maintain housing, and this resource list is a big part of that. We also want to ask people to think evaluatively about their housing, what can be done to make themselves more comfortable and make it more of a priority to be in housing, and how are they setting up their system to follow the lease. We also want to focus on purpose, role, connections, and activity. And the reason for that is because if people have something to do, they're less likely to get into trouble. You know, the number one reason that the people I worked with lost housing is because they were desperately lonely. And they did things to counteract that loneliness, which included moving people in and that sort of stuff. We want to problem solve with people about how to do that. We want to talk about what's working and what's not working. This is often a time when we find, hopefully we find it out before, but sometimes we find that people need to share an apartment, that they can't stand being on their own. So how will that work? We also want to monitor lease compliance, and we want to talk to the landlord at least once a month to find out if people are complying with their lease, and we want to catch it early. So the example we took on before is these landlords aren't getting money, so that they're not going to renew people's lease, or they're going to try to get them out. We should know that when they first aren't getting money. And that's an opportunity to provide the education. It's very hard to provide education about what resources are available to the landlord and to the tenant when somebody's 5 months behind on their lease. We want to start it as early as possible. And that means constant contact. We don't want things to get to a crisis. We want to do crisis prevention with everybody we work with. We also want to build skills, and we want to educate people on tenancy rights. We want to model for each veteran or each person to negotiate for services. We want to help people try it out. We realize that teaching skills takes a lot longer than doing it yourself. But if people are asking you to negotiate for them or advocate for them, we want to have a conversation first about what we're trying to achieve. And we want to, doesn't mean we won't do it. We will do it, but we want to have a debrief conversation afterwards about what skills were used and what things the person can do themselves. The goal is to help people manage their tenancy independently or with the supports of their network of care. We want to talk about costs and benefits, about changing behavior. We want to recognize strong partners. You know, one of the things that we did is that a little positive reinforcement for landlords or service connections or even community connections can go a long way in really cementing that relationship. We want to help people do that. And when people do something that they find helpful, we want to help people say that. That means that people are more likely to do it again. We actually gave people thank you notes and helped them write these thank you notes, and that really made a big difference. We want to renegotiate the relationship if necessary. Sometimes these relationships don't work. And that person's first, with homelessness, people often feel like they only have one choice, and if they don't get that choice, they walk away. And we want to prevent that from walking away because most relationships are negotiated. So if things aren't working, we want to renegotiate the relationship. If that doesn't work, we want to establish another relationship. There's not only one option for people. So we always want to open it up to what's next. We want to change people's expectations from crisis to planning. We don't want people to be as reactive. We want to move from the immediate to 15 minutes. Maybe that's all people can take, right? We want to introduce at least 2 options. We want to help people think critically about things. It slows the process down. It makes people less reactive. Then we want them to use strategies and resources that work best for them. We want to also acknowledge what resources and strategies work best for them in the past and how that applies to this situation. We want to really develop a structure and purpose to people's days. If people have something to do, they're less likely to get into trouble. And also it provides people with a level of stabilization that's impossible through anything else. We want to really focus on roles and what's the difference between being homeless and being a tenant, being a family member. What are the expectations? Expectations bring structure to people's lives. So we're introducing structure so that people can work this structure system because people work a system. We want to introduce them to the system they can work. So want to try something? So what kind of resources, formal and informal, are people connecting to as you first work with them? How does it connect to their housing? How do these resources connect to their housing and their personal goal? what are the gaps in resources or challenges? They could be due to COVID. And then give an example of a training or mentoring technique that helped a tenant connect to a resource. So Felicia is going to put these in the chat box, and then we're going to divide people up into groups. So I think we're going to do the same groups, and then we're going to come back and talk about it. So you should get an invite to these groups. The questions are in the chat. Good. Okay. In the groups about resources, how they're connected to housing. Can unmute yourself. No? No new resources. How about training? How people train people or mentor people to negotiate resources? No? Okay.
I think, Andrea, when you look at some of this, like, I don't think there's probably anybody in this group who doesn't try to do all the things that have been suggested for the
Yeah.
people we work with. But
Yeah.
I think in one of the breakout groups, it was mentioned that some of our people come from years and years of dysfunction and not having anything, that for us in rapid rehousing, for us to try to fix that, or I hate to use the word fix, but for us to improve their mindset in 6 to 12 to 18 months, it's almost an impossible task. It requires long-term support and services from a familiar face. So I would be confident if anytime when they redid this, where you can have a person for a couple years, you make a lot more progress with engagement. Sometimes engagements take 4, 5, 6 months before people begin to trust you and realize that you have their best interest. And then before you know it, you're kind of backing away a little bit. So,
you know, Mark, what the research is telling us and what personal experience is telling us is that's actually not true. And HUD did a thing on, that was the theory behind transitional housing, where people would work with people from 2 years and some people were up to 4 years. They found it was very expensive and it did not have an effect on if people maintained housing. And the information that we're giving now is based on a evidence-based practice called CTI, which is helping people make the transition. And these are key elements in CTI to help people stabilize in housing. And what they're finding is they're really focused on the transition, and that you, in fact, really do work with people around these changes, and the people can make these changes. And in fact, if you go longer than 6 to 9 months, they become more entrenched. So these are really, it's both based on research and also people's practice. And actually CTI was researched about housing-based practice. It was actually, some of it was my practice when I was running a shelter. And I think that we need to think about these things quicker than we see. And that what we're trying to do is certainly change people's perspective, but in very key ways that will help them continue to grow. And it's really enlarging people's engagement. And what they found is engagement with one person, one case manager, or even a case management team actually works against the stabilization. Unless though in some cases, if people are scoring for supportive housing, that does allow for longer engagement, but we even do this with supportive housing, is help step people down.
Andrea, can you explain that a little better? Because that was a little confusing to me. Can you explain? Sure. So I think like Michael was talking about kind of changing people's way of thinking about things. And I think he's right that the role of folks in rapid rehousing is, well, it's time limited, as he said,
yes.
but
yes.
it's also like, how do you focus on the specific, like, because you're focusing on everything.
Right.
Obviously, Like to change someone's perspective or behavior on all the things in their life is not a 6-month, 9-month, 12-month thing. Can you talk a little bit more? Can you clarify a little more what you mean by like where to focus that energy and
Sure.
because that was a little bit confusing to me.
There's
Sorry.
there's a lot of moving parts, right? And so we're talking about motivation. We're also talking about crisis prevention. We're talking about a lot of them. But if we sum it up, we're giving people a structure to work. So we're teaching people a new structure. That's really the focus of all of these things. And the structure is the role of tenant, right? And if we improve people's functioning as a tenant, we can improve their functioning. It has lots of applicability to employment, to maintaining benefits, to even being a parent or other roles that they might take on. But that's why we keep saying we're bringing it back to housing stability, because what we're trying to do is teach people the structure of housing stability. That's really the focus of this. And that we do it in a number of ways. In order to maintain and work a structure, we have to apply motivational techniques, things like mastery and feeling of competence and hopefulness. And that's why we're talking about all the pieces. But you're right, it's all around the structure of maintaining housing, right? And that one of the things that it gets to is we've gone back and forth with landlords. If people are to develop some mastery over tenancy, they will stay in housing. And the other thing is that landlords will be more welcoming to them because they understand what the role is and they can start to do them. Michael's point about people took a long time to get to this and how can we change this? We change this by really focusing on the housing stability and making that the structure of people's lives and having the positive experience around the structure of tenancy, helping them apply that to other pieces of their lives. Why we're asking people what their long-term goals are is because we're going to connect the housing stability. But really all we're working on for the time in rapid rehousing is housing stability. Does that make sense?
And Andrew, if I could just say, because I some things upset me. I have a background in therapy. I spent 33 years. My last 20 years were administration, so I didn't do much direct service, but I managed therapists who did. Engagement's the most important thing of anything that you do when you're dealing with this population of people. I don't question the research. I'd love to read it. And when they use words as expensive, of course it's expensive because you're paying a lot of money for services. However, I was in the 3-part pathway training. And I'm getting new to this. I don't understand all this, but the way Pathways does it, it seems like they work with people longer, they greater, it's more intense. And I will still argue, again, being a baby in this field, the longer I have clients that will call me for everything. They will see me, call me. Those are some of my more successful people because I don't do anything for them. I tell them what to do. And I say, I want you to follow up with me on how that engagement go. Don't call me because you have a drip on a pipe. Okay, I can fix it, but I'm not. You need to call the landlord. You deal with the landlord. You have problems, call me. I will get involved. And I actually took that approach from a training you did in Dover, Delaware. I believe it was you back in Dover when I first started this, that I shouldn't be as involved with landlords that clients should. I've taken that approach. But I will tell you that engagement is the most important thing for people that have screwed up lives, for them to trust me. And for me to move forward, I have to have a good relationship with people. And not always is that going to happen in 6 months. But I will agree with one thing in the research I heard you say, though, I'd love to read it. It's expensive. It's an expensive process, Angie. I don't doubt your knowledge or anyone's knowledge at this table because I'm the baby here, but I know how critical engagement is.
Okay, I think that you're right. Engagement is a part of the process no matter what you're doing. And engagement is really important. I would argue with that you can't engage people. You're engaging them around your role, right? So that if you don't, you have to engage them around your role, but these are techniques to engage people around the role. And the role is to move people to more self-sufficiency. and for them to manage the things themselves. And some of the techniques that you use is helping people engage with their landlord, having a short period of time where you're checking back, supporting people's skills are all part of the engagement process. Pathways to Housing is based on an ACT model.
So actually, Andrea, I wanted to make sure to address that because a number of folks here participated in the Pathways
Yep.
training. So
Yep.
Pathways only does permanent supportive housing for the most highest service need folks who are
Right.
chronically homeless, have been unsheltered for long periods of time. So that training was really focused on that population. For folks that are doing rapid rehousing, the goal
Right.
there was to just really be thinking about the elements of housing first and how those can translate to your rapid rehousing programs. That's a very different program model with a different target population. So I wanted to just make that distinction clear. Because you're right, Michael, they're doing for like very
Forever.
intensive, potentially forever services for folks.
Forever.
It's going to be very different than what rapid rehousing is doing.
That's right. And that the thing to take away from that is the criteria to get in those services is very high. So in the Pathways program in New York, people had to have multiple psychiatric hospitalizations in order to even qualify, right? So that the level the level is very high. It's even higher than supportive housing, but it is a long-term project. And in that case, I actually think that Pathways doesn't do a good enough job helping people develop their own network of care because they can become very insular. And in fact, in New York, where Pathways started, one of the things they're looking at is stepping people down from that ACT model and having them use more community-based resources. And they're actually using a model of critical time intervention to move people off that model. The reality is we're never going to be able to afford, by the way, the caseload of Pathways to Housing is 1 to 10. And they have psychiatrists and nurses. They have the whole network of care as part of their program. And they're actually stepping people down from that model because partially it's too expensive. And secondarily, long-term outcomes using a more case management model and a shorter term case management has been seen as more effective. And if you look at the numbers in New York, most of the supportive housing where the services are available long-term, people use a step down course, and that the numbers about housing retention are equally as high for Pathways and for these other models, which also deal with very high acuity clients. So part of it is the acuity and who gets referred in, but that the other part is that we've got to look at the theory that we're teaching people housing stability so they can use those skills going forward. Hey, Wendell, it sounds like this is pretty solid in your organization from the comments that you made. What do you think about this model of helping people transfer over to this network of care?
Yeah, I mean, actually I consult for a evidence-based therapy model, and so it links perfectly to like what we would do in that model. So engagement starts really early and then it's ongoing throughout.
Yeah.
But it's actually not a long process. When you first meet someone, they're going to have an assessment of who you are pretty quick.
Yep.
This is like the generalization piece around you're in the house. Now we want to connect you to the people that are going to follow with you from here on out. Call us when you need a bump back to those services. But we're fine quarterbacking. We just don't want to have to always run back out. And if we can get some services that people feel really safe with, that's like the dream right there for us. And so we have some pretty specific partners that we feel really comfortable making those initial follow-up referrals with.
Can you talk about what sort of resources you're using to make those initial follow-up services?
Yeah, we have a really good relationship with Jewish Family Services. So we'll do like a soft touch with their employment support network, which is based around employment, but they also do a lot of emotional support. So they connect you with a mentor, and that person becomes very close with the person they're working with. They meet weekly, and they'll start to bring them into more other services if they need to. We will work with WonderWorks a lot of times, and I'm trying to think the other ones that we use a lot, but Brandywine we'll use because we can kind of go into the guise of they'll help people with SRAP. But really what they'll do is do the counseling and things like that too. And so they have a case manager that gets really intensive with the families, and that helps us a lot.
So you do a couple of things. You transfer that initial engagement to a service that you trust, which is huge, right?
Yep.
And then you're broadening out people's network of care, which is really what we're saying here. So
Yeah.
that's a great example.
Yeah, it's a lot of warm handoffs because we trust the people trust us. So
Yep.
when we say we're gonna have you work with this service, they'll go with it.
Great. And then, but you also give them some information about the person, right? About what motivates them and stuff like that. Do you use motivation? Do you think consciously about their motivation in order to make these connections?
Yeah, I have a family I'm working with right now, and her mental health is really bad. She's struggling with substances, and she does not want treatment for that, but she does want SRAP. And so my motivation in getting her into treatment is to say, like, I can financially empower you. You're going to have to do these other things, but like, hang in there with me. We'll get through that. We'll get you to where you want to be. And that got her to pursue legitimate treatment.
It's great. That's a perfect example of what we're talking about here. That's a great thing. What sort of evidence-based practices do you mentor people on?
Functional family therapy.
Yep.
So, yeah.
Yep. Yep. Take a look at CTI. You might be interested.
Yeah, Cheryl, our ED, has showed it to me before, and it's something that she's interested in bringing on board. And so I've been learning a little bit about that for sure.
Yep. It provides that structure. That's great.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anybody else have comments? Is this resonating for people? Maybe, maybe not. Okay. The other thing is to coordinate with property managers. We talked a lot about this, but the other thing is that just as we work with tenants to fulfill their tenancy obligations, landlords have to fulfill their landlord obligation. So they have a key role in helping people understand their lease violations by consistently enforcing the lease, right? They take an assertive approach. They have clear and consistent tenancy obligations. They don't change, and they don't change by person so that people can learn them. And then the services job is to assist people to meet the tenancy obligations. This is key in housing stabilization. When we want to strike a balance between competing forces, landlords obviously have financial demands of the building, security, community versus individual tenants. We are going to advocate because that's our job, but we're going to teach people how to advocate for themselves, and we're going to connect them with partners in a network of care that can continue to assist them to meet these obligations. We're going to get a collaborative relationship between the landlord and social services, but they have separate functions. Services does not enforce the lease because you lose your ability to provide case management. One of the people I worked with one time said it's hard to be a cop and a priest at the same time, but we help people meet the obligations that are set forth by the landlord and the lease. And we give them choices how to meet those obligations. And we also develop a path, just like what Wendell said, is that one of the things that person was doing is they clearly wanted to increase their income. So they were more interested in the SPATH program. But in order to do that, in order to fully function in that program, they had to address some of the mental health issues, and that they provided them with contacts in order to do that. And those all go to stable tenancy. Increasing income is a huge part of this. And that's often why people are motivated to address those other issues that might interfere with tenancy now and in the future, is because they get something they want and they connect it to their life and their long-term goals. We are going to develop a fully integrated building. It's an asset to the community. We want to talk to people about being proud of the place that they live and participating in that. We want to also coordinate that with the landlord and talk about what the landlord's goals are, much like we talk about the tenancy goals. And landlords want a building that they can be proud of, but tenants also want that. So there's some synergy between the values and the things that people want. We're going to manage the coordination. We're going to help people understand what our role is. Our role is not to take problematic people out of apartments. Our role is to help people meet the expectations. It's also not to create a chaotic atmosphere. It is not okay if people don't follow the lease. The lease is non-negotiable now and in the future, in their future housing. So we want to talk about what are the real expectations and what can be enforced and how people follow those applications. We want to get input from property management staff, from landlords, and that they want to get input from the services staff. So that communication is really important. We want clear procedures about communication, about confidentiality, eviction prevention process. What's the eviction process? How are lease violations handled, and how are crisis procedures handled, so we can prepare people for that. So an example is most case managers aren't available 24/7. So what happens if something happens in the middle of the night? The landlord is likely, if it's an emergency, the landlord is likely to either address the emergency or call the police or some sort of emergency staff. So we want to prepare people for that these are things that are happening in the building. This is how you handle it. This is what you can do. You also want to get a copy of their lease violations. So something that might be helpful to you guys is there's a property management manual, and you can just click on this link. And in the back, there are letters that landlords can send. You had mentioned that you deal with a lot of small landlords. Oftentimes, they don't have the capacity, the time, or the resources to develop these letters to tenants, and they tend to do most things verbally. That can be easily misunderstood. In the back of this manual, there's some sample letters that landlords can send to people about lease violations. So this might be helpful to you. So, okay. So let's talk about, we're going to try one more exercise. And once again, Felicia's going to put them in the chat box, and we're going to divide people up. People have 10 minutes. And it's, how are you currently coordinating with property managers and landlords? What lease violations are tenants receiving? Are the rules clear about which staff enforce the lease and which staff support tenants to meet these requirements? And what are the challenges that you face in supporting tenants and coordinating with property managers? Obviously, you don't have to answer every question. These are guides for discussions. You can also put feelings, thoughts, comments in the chat box, but we're going to break people up. So, yeah, did I not put these in the document? Oh, okay, hold on one sec. Yep, they're in the document. It should be, say, slide 23. Here, I am going to put these in this. Let's see. So those should be in the chat box. So we're going to break people up into meetings. Does everybody see them in the chat box? Felicia, can you see those? You guys, somebody's got to answer.
Hey, Andrea. So those are the questions that we just answered in the last breakout session. We've had a total of 3.
Did I do the enforcing the lease in the last breakout session? No, the last breakout session was on resources, I thought. How do you coordinate with property managers? That was in the last breakout session?
Oh, you know what? Those questions accidentally went directly to Rachel.
Okay.
So those were the questions that were supposed to be discussed in the last breakout session.
Huh.
Yeah, because we don't have any more questions in there.
Okay, so you guys look at these. Did you talk about coordinating with property managers the last time? I thought the last time was resources. Miranda, can you unmute?
These aren't the questions that were in the last chat box.
Okay.
You didn't even get the questions in the last chat box when you came back to the questions about
Okay.
resources.
Okay, okay. Okay, so that explains it. So these are the questions for this breakout. So everybody got the questions? So let's do the breakout. Felicia, if you could,
When she does the breakout, we don't get the questions.
well, they're in the, okay, so
No, ours didn't show. That's what I'm saying. The last session that we had, ours didn't show in either session that I was in. They didn't show in the chat.
okay.
So
So,
that's not true. The first ones did, the second ones didn't.
okay, so this is, now they're in the chat, and if you get them before you go into the breakout, they should be there. If you don't get the questions, just signal me, right? You can send a broadcast message and that sort of stuff, and we'll come into your session. We'll come into your breakout and give you the questions. But because they're in the chat now, they should be in this one. Okay, so Felicia, let's break people out. I'm just going to watch it to make sure that people join. Okay. Let's see how this is going. Okay, good. Good, good, good. Okay.
So John
Felicia-
might have stepped away.
Yeah. Felicia, you want to join room 1 and make sure they have the questions, and I'm going to try 2 and 3.
Sure. We'll do
Okay, thank you.
that. Mhm.
Hello. So does everybody have the questions? No? There's also some resources for tenant education. We went over both of these than the last group, but they were under different context. And I just want to remind people of those resources.
Andrea, will we have available, will these slides and presentations be shared with us? Because I didn't get the last ones. I was
Yes.
wanting to know if we could have them.
Yes. So the slides will be are in the chat. Rachel put them in the chat. The slides and the resources are in the chat, and you are free to use those. And the other part of this is that, Felicia, can you send these out to people just so they get them on email as well? Sometimes it's hard to download stuff from the chat, but if you look at the chat, and we can leave the chat open for a little bit, if you look at the chat, you can download them.
Yeah,
Mike,
so
they're also available on the website as well, Mike.
Ah, okay. So both sessions are available on the website.
yes.
So I just want to say to people, I apologize for this. I went way over. I've never done this before, 17 minutes over. I appreciate your sticking it out. And I want to thank everybody so much for participating. And I want to give you back your day. And I apologize for taking up more than I said I would. So thank you.